Imagine standing on the shores of Zanzibar in the 19th century, watching the sails of trading vessels rising on the horizon. The island bustled with activity, markets overflowing with spices, ivory, and textiles. Yet beneath the noise of commerce, another current flowed, a current that carried human lives into a vast and hidden system that endured far longer than many realize. While the transatlantic trade is often remembered as a defining chapter of suffering and exploitation, another story was unfolding in East Africa. It lasted longer, reached deeper into the continent, and involved countless communities whose voices remain faint echoes today. Historians estimate that nearly 18 million people were drawn into this system over centuries, with Zanzibar as the epicenter of exchange, diplomacy, and power. To picture it is to understand the paradox of history. A place celebrated for its beauty and trade was also the heart of an enterprise that reshaped families, villages, and entire regions. From the late 8th century through the 19th century, waves of expeditions moved inland, bringing back not only ivory and cloves but also people whose stories were forever changed. Many were sent across the Indian Ocean, others to distant ports in Arabia, Persia, and beyond. And while the ships and routes may differ from what we know of the Atlantic world, the human impact was just as profound. What makes this history even more striking is how often it has been overlooked. Textbooks highlight one version of events while leaving another in the shadows. Yet the echoes remain, in the architecture of Zanzibar's stone town, in oral traditions passed down through generations, in the scars carried silently across societies. This is not a simple tale of past wrongs, it is a reminder of how the world we know today was shaped by forces rarely spoken of. In this story, we will uncover the rise of one figure whose name became inseparable from this era. He was a man who built immense wealth, wielded enormous influence, and whose empire stretched across Central and East Africa. His actions left a legacy that still sparks debate, and his life reveals how ambition and opportunity could collide with devastating effect. To understand him, we must first understand the world that made his rise possible, a world where Zanzibar was not just a trading port but a crossroads of human destiny. This journey is not about sensationalism. It is about rediscovering what has been forgotten, piecing together fragments of history that deserve to be remembered. As we walk through the past, we'll see not only the choices of one man but also the broader currents of empire, economy, and survival. If you find value in uncovering these hidden chapters of history, support this work by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others. Together we can ensure that stories long silenced are brought back into the light, and that history's lessons are never left behind. On the island of Zanzibar, in the early decades of the 19th century, a child was born who would grow into one of the most talked about figures in East African history. The year was around 1832, a time when the island was alive with energy. Ships crowded its harbor, merchants bargained in its winding alleys, and spices perfumed the humid air. Yet beneath this vibrant facade, Zanzibar was more than a paradise of trade, it was the beating heart of a system that shaped the lives of millions. Into this complex world came a boy named Hamad bin Muhammad. From the beginning, his life was tied to both privilege and contradiction. His family's roots ran deep, his mother came from an influential Arab background, tied to the ruling elite, while his father descended from the coastal Swahili, themselves skilled traders and navigators. Even further back in his lineage, there were connections to Bantu communities of the mainland. This mixture of heritages gave him not only status but also access. He could move between different identities, navigating the diverse and competitive landscape of East African trade with ease. For a boy growing up in Stone Town, opportunity was everywhere, but so too was the shadow of ambition. As he grew older, Hamad proved to be both observant and restless. The narrow lanes of Zanzibar, with their carved wooden doors and bustling markets, could not contain his hunger for influence. He listened to the stories told by travelers returning from the mainland, tales of dense forests, rivers filled with crocodiles, villages rich in ivory, and long caravans that stretched as far as the eye could see. These stories fired his imagination. More than anything, they promised wealth and power for those daring enough to seize them. It was during these early years that a nickname began to follow him, a name that would soon eclipse the one given at birth. The origin was unusual, even dramatic. On his expeditions inland, the young Hamad often carried firearms, weapons that echoed through the forests with a sharp, repetitive sound. Local communities, hearing this distinctive noise, began to call him Tippu Tip, after the tip-tip rhythm of his guns. What began as an observation quickly became a legend. To many, the name symbolized fear and authority; to others, it marked him as a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. Names can shape reputations, and for Hamad, this new identity was more than just a label, it was a brand. Tippu Tip became the name that merchants whispered with respect, that rivals spoke with caution, and that travelers carried back to the coast in stories half in awe and half in dread. The sound of those guns was not only a signal of his power but also a metaphor for the way he cut through the world around him. Every echo of Tip Tip carried with it a reminder that he was no ordinary trader. But what made him stand apart was not only his ability to intimidate. Tippu Tip was also a strategist. He had the gift of seeing opportunity where others saw only risk. He gathered followers, men willing to march with him into unknown lands, trusting his leadership and ambition. With each journey inland, his reputation grew. He brought back not only ivory, prized in markets as far away as Europe and Asia, but also influence. These returns strengthened his position in Zanzibar, where wealth was measured in plantations, networks, and the ability to command loyalty. Yet, beneath the surface, there was always a duality to his story. On the one hand, Tippu Tip was the embodiment of success in a world where commerce defined power. On the other, his rise came through choices that left deep scars across the lands he traversed. Villages remembered the caravans that passed through, families recalled the footsteps of men carrying guns, and generations carried forward the memory of what his name meant. His identity was forged not only in his own ambition but also in the consequences of his actions. As Tippu Tip aged, the nickname never left him. It traveled with him from Zanzibar to the Congo Basin, from the courts of sultans to the tents of European explorers. Even when he sat among foreign dignitaries or corresponded with colonial officials, the name that echoed was not Hamad bin Muhammad but Tippu Tip. It was as though the boy from Stone Town had been consumed by the legend he had created, a legend born from the simple rhythm of a gunshot in the forest. Looking back, his story reminds us that history often remembers people not for the names they were given but for the identities they forged through action, reputation, and myth. In the case of Tippu Tip, his chosen path made his nickname inseparable from his legacy. The sound of those guns has long since faded into silence, but the memory of the man who carried them continues to reverberate through time. In the crowded harbor of Zanzibar, in the fading walls of his stone town home, and in the histories of the lands he once crossed, the name Tippu Tip lingers like an echo, sharp, haunting, and unforgettable. In the bustling port of Zanzibar during the early 19th century, identity was more than just a matter of birth. It was a mosaic, a tapestry woven from the countless peoples who passed through its markets and harbors. The island stood at the crossroads of Africa, Arabia, and the wider Indian Ocean world, and here, in the midst of clashing cultures and converging traditions, a boy named Hamad bin Muhammad was born into a heritage that made him unlike many others. His lineage was not singular but layered, carrying threads from multiple worlds. From his Arab forebears, he inherited connections to the ruling elites and to centuries-old maritime traditions. These ties stretched across the seas, binding Zanzibar to Oman, Persia, and the ports of the Arabian Peninsula. From his Swahili roots came the rhythms of the coast, the songs, the stories, and the deep understanding of how to navigate the intricate networks of commerce that linked inland communities with oceanic traders. And within his Bantu ancestry lay the strength of the mainland, the agricultural heart of East Africa, and the cultural traditions that pulsed across villages, rivers, and forests. Together, these influences created not only a child but a bridge between worlds. For a boy growing up in Stone Town, this mixture was a gift. The narrow, sunlit streets hummed with voices speaking in many tongues, Arabic, Swahili, Hindi, and Portuguese. Spices scented the air, blending with the salty wind from the sea. In such a setting, belonging to just one world would have been limiting. But Hamad's identity allowed him to move with ease from the private chambers of Arab merchants to the bustling markets of Swahili traders, and even to the mainland communities that supplied the goods filling Zanzibar's warehouses. The diversity of his background gave him something more powerful than wealth: access. In the 1800s, trade was not simply about moving goods, it was about forging trust, alliances, and obligations. A man who could speak to different groups, who could claim kinship across divides, who understood the customs of both city and village, such a man was destined to thrive. Hamad, even as a young boy, was steeped in this environment of constant negotiation and exchange. He listened carefully, learned quickly, and absorbed the subtle art of crossing boundaries without losing himself. This blended heritage also shaped his worldview. Where others saw obstacles between cultures, Hamad saw pathways. Where others hesitated at the edge of unfamiliar customs, he recognized opportunities. His Arab ties linked him to the powerful sultans who ruled Zanzibar and Oman, men who sought to expand their influence deep into the African interior. His Swahili heritage anchored him in the coastal world of dhows, sailors, and merchants who had for centuries managed the delicate balance of trade across the Indian Ocean. And through his Bantu ancestry, he was connected to the mainland, to the forests and savannas that supplied ivory, spices, and countless other riches. In time, this unique position would serve him well. When he began to lead his own expeditions into the interior, he carried with him not only goods and weapons but also relationships. Villages along the way saw in him something familiar, a link to their own people. Coastal traders respected his skill and background. Arab leaders trusted him as one of their own. Each strand of his ancestry acted as a key, unlocking doors that might have remained closed to others. It is easy to imagine young Hamad walking along the harbor as dhows arrived from distant lands, their sails heavy with wind and their hulls packed with goods. He would have heard sailors shouting in Arabic, Swahili, and other tongues, their voices carrying over the clatter of carts and the cries of market vendors. To him, these sounds were not foreign, they were part of his inheritance, part of the world he belonged to. This was the environment that nurtured Tippu Tip's future, a place where identities blended as seamlessly as the spices that filled Zanzibar's air. In a world where trust was currency, his family's diverse background made him richer than gold. He could claim the heritage of the desert and the sea, the coast and the forest. This ability to weave himself into multiple narratives meant he was never entirely an outsider, no matter where he traveled. When he reached the great rivers of Central Africa, he carried not only his name but the weight of connections that spanned continents. His ancestry was not merely a detail of birth, it was the foundation of his rise. Without it, he might have been another trader in a crowded port, lost to the tides of history. With it, he became a figure remembered long after his time, a man whose story reveals the complexity of identity in a world where boundaries were constantly shifting. Thus, the tale of Tippu Tip begins not with his journeys into the heart of Africa, nor with his dealings with sultans and explorers, but with his family, a family that embodied the convergence of worlds. From these roots grew a man who would leave an indelible mark on history, a man whose life was shaped by the unique power of heritage, connection, and the ability to belong everywhere at once. The first whispers of Hamad bin Muhammad's rise, by then already known as Tippu Tip, began not in the grand courts of Zanzibar or the bustling alleys of Stone Town, but deep in the interior of Africa. As a young man, he was restless, ambitious, and unwilling to remain a minor figure in a crowded world of merchants. The coast, though rich with opportunities, felt too narrow for his vision. The great fortunes, he realized, lay far inland, beyond the coastal plantations and familiar markets. There, in the vast forests and winding rivers of Central Africa, ivory waited to be claimed, and ivory was the key to power. The decision to lead an expedition was not one taken lightly. The mainland was no easy terrain. Dense forests swallowed caravans whole, rivers overflowed without warning, and unfamiliar lands posed countless dangers. Yet to Tippu Tip, these challenges were not barriers but invitations. He gathered a band of followers, men who trusted his leadership, who were willing to march for months on end through heat, hunger, and uncertainty. With careful planning, he organized long caravans carrying goods for trade, firearms for protection, and supplies to sustain the grueling journeys. At first, his ventures were small, testing both his ability and the loyalty of those who followed him. The early returns, however, were promising. Tusks of ivory, gleaming, prized, and rare, began to flow from the interior back to Zanzibar. There, they were eagerly bought and shipped across oceans, destined for markets as far away as India, the Middle East, and Europe. The profits from these journeys set Tippu Tip apart from ordinary traders. Not only was he acquiring wealth, but he was also building a reputation. Each successful caravan reinforced his image as a man capable of taming the dangers of the interior and bringing back riches where others might fail. But wealth alone was not enough to cement his name. Tippu Tip had ambition that stretched further than personal gain. With every expedition, he extended his influence deeper inland. Villages that once regarded him as a stranger learned to recognize his power. His men, organized, armed, and disciplined, moved like a force unto themselves, leaving behind stories that spread along trade routes faster than the caravans themselves. The tales painted him as both respected and feared, a figure whose presence could change the fortunes of entire regions. The ivory trade was his golden path, but it was not without complexity. To acquire tusks, he had to negotiate with local leaders, build alliances, and sometimes impose authority. This required not only strength but also tact. He spoke the languages of the coast and understood the traditions of the interior, making him an effective mediator when disputes arose. In this way, he gained not just ivory but networks of influence, relationships that stretched across vast territories. Still, the further he pushed into the heart of Central Africa, the more his expeditions became entwined with the darker realities of the trade. Ivory was heavy and difficult to transport. Caravans needed manpower to carry tusks across long distances, through forests where no road existed. This demand for labor became an inseparable part of Tippu Tip's rise. Human lives, like ivory, became commodities that could be exchanged, controlled, and used to sustain the machinery of commerce. Through this dual pursuit, ivory and control over people, his reputation only grew stronger. He became more than a trader, he became a leader of men, an architect of expeditions that stretched farther and lasted longer than those of his rivals. By the time European explorers stumbled into Central Africa, they often found Tippu Tip already there, his caravans dominating the very landscapes they hoped to map and claim. To them, he was not an unknown figure but a formidable presence, a man whose name had already traveled ahead of him. The young leader who once walked the alleys of Zanzibar now strode across territories vast and uncharted by outsiders. His fortunes multiplied, his influence extended, and his name echoed from the Indian Ocean to the Congo Basin. For Tippu Tip, every journey inland was not only a search for wealth but also a performance of power. Each expedition proved his ability to control, to organize, and to thrive where danger and uncertainty ruled. What began as a single caravan became a career, and what began as an ambitious gamble grew into a legacy. Tippu Tip's youth was defined by these expeditions, relentless marches into the unknown, returning with riches that fueled his rise. Ivory gleamed in the markets of Zanzibar, but behind each tusk lay the story of endurance, conflict, and ambition. And at the center of it all stood Tippu Tip, the young expedition leader who transformed himself from a restless island boy into a figure whose name carried weight across half a continent. His journey from the coast to the interior was more than physical, it was the transformation of his identity. With each step inland, he carved out a larger role for himself, until finally, the legend of Tippu Tip grew larger than the man. In his youth, he set the foundation for the empire of influence he would one day command, and it all began with the decision to lead, to risk, and to claim the ivory that others feared to pursue. Far from the turquoise waters of Zanzibar's coast, deep in the interior of Central Africa, a new center of power began to take shape. It was not born of ancient dynasties or royal bloodlines, but of ambition, trade, and the relentless will of one man, Hamad bin Muhammad, known widely as Tippu Tip. By the time his name had spread along caravan routes and through the markets of the Indian Ocean, he had already mastered the art of survival in the interior. Yet his vision stretched beyond temporary wealth. He sought permanence, a seat of authority that would outlast fleeting expeditions. From that vision, the Sultanate of Uttara emerged, with Kasongo as its capital. Kasongo, a town deep in the Congo basin, may not have appeared destined for greatness. It was far from the polished stone houses and busy harbors of Zanzibar. But for Tippu Tip, its position was strategic, a crossroads between ivory-rich forests, rivers that served as highways, and villages that lay along the lifelines of trade. Establishing Kasongo as his capital was both a practical decision and a symbolic act. Here, in the very heart of the continent, he planted the roots of his influence. The creation of Uttara was unlike the rise of coastal kingdoms. There were no ancient palaces or gilded thrones, no ancestral legends carved in stone. Instead, its foundation was laid with caravans, firearms, and the relentless flow of ivory. Tippu Tip transformed the town into a bustling hub, where goods from the interior met the demands of the coast. Traders, porters, hunters, and local leaders converged on Kasongo, drawn by its growing reputation as the seat of a man whose reach extended across thousands of miles. But this was not merely a trading post. Tippu Tip styled himself not just as a merchant but as a ruler. His word carried the weight of law, and his presence demanded respect. He established systems of order within his domain, creating a structure that gave him both economic and political control. Those who allied with him were rewarded with access to trade and protection. Those who opposed him often found themselves isolated, unable to compete with the resources and influence he commanded. The lifeblood of Uttara was ivory. Each tusk represented weeks of hunting, long journeys through thick forests, and the efforts of countless men. From Kasongo, ivory flowed outward in staggering quantities, destined for Zanzibar, where it would be shipped across the seas to markets in India, the Middle East, and Europe. The wealth it generated was immense, and with it came weapons, cloth, and goods that further solidified Tippu Tip's power. He was no longer a wandering leader of expeditions, he was the master of a domain whose reach rivaled that of established sultanates along the Swahili coast. Yet ivory was not the only force that sustained Uttara. Control of labor was central to maintaining the machinery of trade. Caravans required men to carry tusks, to transport goods, and to guard routes that stretched across dangerous and hostile terrain. The vast system Tippu Tip oversaw relied on this constant movement of people, binding the fortunes of countless communities to the rise of his empire. Through this, his influence extended not just geographically but socially, weaving together a network of dependencies that made him indispensable. By the late 19th century, no figure in East or Central Africa commanded the same level of respect, fear, and recognition as Tippu Tip. He was spoken of not just as a trader but as a ruler in his own right, a man whose authority stretched from the Indian Ocean coast deep into the Congo basin. European explorers, upon reaching these lands, often found themselves in his shadow. Some relied on his hospitality and knowledge, others warily observed his power, recognizing that his presence could make or break their journeys. Kasongo became the symbol of this dominance. It was a city alive with the noise of hammers and voices, the smell of smoke and trade, the sight of endless caravans arriving and departing. It stood as a testament to Tippu Tip's ability to create order in a region where outsiders often saw only chaos. His capital was not a relic of ancient power but a modern construction of ambition, forged through the blending of local alliances, trade networks, and sheer determination. The Sultanate of Uttara was more than a kingdom in name, it was a demonstration of how commerce could be transformed into sovereignty. Tippu Tip had built an empire on the foundations of ivory and influence, ruling from a capital carved out of the wilderness. His story is not merely one of trade but of transformation, from caravan leader to ruler, from merchant to sultan. By founding Uttara, Tippu Tip inscribed his name not only in the annals of commerce but also in the political history of Central Africa. He had taken the tools of trade and turned them into instruments of power. And though his empire would eventually be challenged by European colonial ambitions, the memory of Uttara and its capital Kasongo endures as a symbol of a time when one man's vision reshaped the heart of the continent. In the second half of the 19th century, the deep forests and vast rivers of Central Africa were still largely unknown to Europeans. Maps contained more blank spaces than details, and the region was spoken of with awe and mystery in the salons of London, Lisbon, and Brussels. Into this world of uncertainty stepped a man who was already at home in the terrain, Hamad bin Muhammad, better known as Tippu Tip. For explorers who dared to push into the heart of Africa, he was not merely a figure on the periphery, he was the key to survival, the broker of safe passage, and the gatekeeper to regions they could not reach alone. It was in this context that Tippu Tip encountered some of the most famous names of the era. Men like David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary and explorer whose journeys had captured the imagination of Europe, found themselves relying on his knowledge of the land, his networks of porters, and his authority over the trade routes. Livingstone, weary from years of navigating rivers and jungles, recognized that to move further inland, he needed the assistance of someone who had already mastered the environment. Tippu Tip, with his vast experience and logistical skill, provided exactly that. Their interactions were complex, part partnership, part negotiation, and always marked by an undercurrent of mutual need. Years later, another explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, would step into this same web of relationships. Stanley's fame came not only from his bold expeditions but also from the dramatic moment when he found the long-missing Livingstone, greeting him with words that echoed across history. Yet even Stanley, bold and determined as he was, soon realized that navigating the Congo Basin was an endeavor too great for any lone European adventurer. The rivers were treacherous, the forests overwhelming, and the distances nearly impossible without the support of someone who already commanded influence in the region. That someone was Tippu Tip. Stanley and Tippu Tip developed a working relationship that served both their ambitions. For Stanley, it meant access, porters, supplies, and security for his expeditions. For Tippu Tip, it meant recognition of his authority and a chance to strengthen his position as a leader whose power extended not only across Africa but into the imaginations of Europeans. Their collaboration was pragmatic, built on the understanding that in an environment as unforgiving as Central Africa, survival depended on alliances, however temporary or uneasy they might be. But Tippu Tip's role was not confined to helping explorers carve paths through the wilderness. He was also a shrewd political operator who understood the shifting tides of the era. As European powers began to cast their eyes on Africa, debating spheres of influence and drawing imaginary borders on maps thousands of miles away, Tippu Tip maneuvered carefully. He was more than a local leader, he was a negotiator who engaged directly with colonial authorities, offering cooperation when it served his interests and resisting when it threatened his independence. He became, in effect, a bridge between two worlds. On one hand, he was the master of inland networks, commanding loyalty and respect from countless people across East and Central Africa. On the other, he was recognized by European powers as a figure too influential to ignore. Officials saw in him both an obstacle and an asset, a man whose cooperation could ease their entry into the interior but whose dominance could not easily be brushed aside. Tippu Tip played this dual role with remarkable skill, striking agreements, offering services, and at times even serving as a governor under the authority of the Sultan of Zanzibar, an arrangement that also aligned with European interests in the region. These collaborations, however, were never simple friendships. They were transactions in the truest sense, exchanges of power, knowledge, and resources, each side seeking to gain an advantage. Explorers like Livingstone and Stanley wrote their accounts for European readers, often portraying themselves as lone heroes, but the reality was far more complicated. Behind their journeys stood Tippu Tip and men like him, whose contributions made those epic tales possible. The image of the fearless European explorer striding through uncharted lands endures in popular memory, yet the truth is that these figures relied heavily on African intermediaries who guided them, supplied them, and ensured their safety. Tippu Tip was not simply an assistant in this process, he was a central figure whose cooperation could determine the success or failure of an entire expedition. Through these interactions, his reputation spread beyond the markets of Zanzibar and the towns of the Congo. His name became known in European capitals, where colonial officials debated strategies and explorers recounted their triumphs. He was spoken of as both an ally and a rival, a man whose power was undeniable and whose role in the unfolding drama of Africa's encounter with Europe could not be ignored. In the end, Tippu Tip's collaborations with explorers and colonial authorities were part of a larger story, one of negotiation, adaptation, and survival in a rapidly changing world. He was a man rooted in the traditions of East Africa, yet he also understood the ambitions of distant empires. By straddling these two spheres, he carved out a place for himself as both a local ruler and an international power broker. His story reminds us that history is rarely a simple tale of discovery or conquest. It is, instead, a complex dance of alliances and rivalries, where figures like Tippu Tip shaped events just as profoundly as the celebrated explorers whose names fill the pages of history books. The year was 1887, and the Congo River thundered through dense jungles, carrying with it not only the lifeblood of the land but also the ambitions of men who sought to control it. At a place called Stanley Falls, a clash of power had erupted, one that revealed the fragile balance between local authority and the growing reach of European expansion. Out of this turbulence emerged a decision that would place Hamad bin Muhammad, known widely as Tippu Tip, in a position that few could have imagined. He was to be named governor of the district, serving under the newly established Congo Free State. To understand the weight of that appointment, one must first picture the scene. Stanley Falls was not just another point on the map, it was a strategic outpost where river met empire, and where every move echoed with consequence. Traders, soldiers, and local leaders all watched the unfolding events with keen eyes, for they knew that control of this region meant access to wealth, influence, and the authority to shape what the future of Central Africa would look like. The conflict that had broken out there was more than a local skirmish. It was a signal that the old ways of trade and power were colliding with the ambitions of Europe, which was beginning to carve the continent into territories claimed not by tradition but by treaties and force. For Tippu Tip, the moment was both a challenge and an opportunity. His life had been built on navigating the intricate networks of the interior, leading caravans, forging alliances, and commanding loyalty across vast regions. But now he was being asked to step into a new role, one that carried with it the title of governor under a European regime. It was not an offer made lightly. The Congo Free State, driven by the vision of King Leopold II of Belgium, sought to expand its reach deep into the interior, and officials recognized that they could not achieve this without the cooperation of someone who already commanded authority on the ground. Tippu Tip was that man. Accepting the position meant walking a tightrope. On one side were his long-standing ties with the Arab and Swahili trading networks, built over generations and woven into his very identity. On the other side were the Europeans, eager to establish dominance and bring the Congo under their control. To balance these two worlds required diplomacy of the highest order. Tippu Tip understood that he could not simply abandon one for the other. Instead, he sought to position himself as a mediator, a figure who could manage local realities while also satisfying the demands of European officials. His governorship at Stanley Falls was emblematic of this balancing act. To local communities and trading partners, he remained a powerful figure whose influence stretched far beyond the outpost itself. To the Europeans, he was presented as a loyal administrator who could stabilize the region and extend their authority without the need for constant conflict. Yet beneath this veneer of cooperation lay a far more complex reality. Tippu Tip was no mere servant of colonial ambitions. He was a strategist who sought to use the new order to maintain his own power, preserve his networks, and navigate the dangerous tides of imperial expansion. The appointment also symbolized a turning point in African history. Here was a man of Arab, Swahili, and African heritage, deeply rooted in local traditions, now carrying the title of governor within a European empire. It was a fusion of worlds that had once seemed incompatible, and it revealed just how fluid the boundaries of power could be. To the Congo Free State, Tippu Tip was both a tool and a risk, someone who could help pacify the region but whose influence might also rival their own. To Tippu Tip, the title was both an honor and a burden, for it placed him at the center of a struggle that was reshaping the continent. His time as governor was marked by constant negotiation. Every decision carried weight: how to manage the flow of goods along the river, how to appease European officials eager for control, and how to maintain trust with the local leaders who had long relied on his authority. It was a precarious role, one that demanded not only strength but also the ability to read the undercurrents of change. The Congo was no longer a land of hidden forests and unknown rivers, it was becoming a battlefield of influence, where each step could determine the fate of entire communities. Looking back, Tippu Tip's governorship at Stanley Falls reveals the complexity of an era often remembered in stark contrasts of conqueror and conquered. His life in this period defies simple categorization. Was he a collaborator, lending his authority to European expansion? Or was he a pragmatist, using the title to secure his place in a world that was rapidly shifting beyond recognition? The truth lies somewhere in between, in the gray spaces where survival and ambition intertwine. In 1887, when Tippu Tip accepted the governorship, he did more than take on a new role. He became a symbol of the crossroads at which Africa stood. One foot rooted in centuries-old traditions, the other stepping into the machinery of colonial rule. His story in this chapter reminds us that history is not always written in absolutes. It is written in the choices of individuals navigating forces far greater than themselves, choices that shaped not only their own destinies but the destiny of nations. The early 1890s were a stormy period in Central Africa, a time when old powers and new empires clashed in battles that determined who would control the heart of the continent. After years of uneasy alliances and fragile agreements, tensions finally erupted into open conflict. Tippu Tip, who had once balanced his authority between local networks and European ambitions, had stepped back from direct command. But his influence did not vanish. His son, Sefiu bin Hamid, and his trusted ally, the formidable trader and commander Rumaliza, carried the mantle of leadership. Together, they led forces into one of the fiercest struggles of the era, a war that pitted their strength against the armies of King Leopold II's Congo Free State. It began in 1892, when disputes over territory, trade, and influence could no longer be resolved through words. The Congo Free State, under Leopold's rule, was determined to tighten its grip on the eastern regions. This was not merely about borders on a map, it was about control of vital routes, access to resources, and the assertion of dominance in a region where Arab Swahili leaders had long held sway. For Sefiu and Rumaliza, the challenge was clear: defend the networks that their families and communities had built over generations. To surrender would mean not only the loss of power but also the erasure of their way of life. The battles that followed were fierce and relentless. Along rivers and through dense forests, Sefiu's forces engaged the Free State troops in campaigns that lasted for 2 years. These were not minor skirmishes but prolonged confrontations that tested the endurance of both sides. Sefiu, inheriting his father's reputation for strategy, rallied men from across the region, building armies that could stand against the well-supplied European forces. His ally Rumaliza, known for his resourcefulness and determination, brought experience and charisma to the fight, ensuring that their cause did not falter even in the face of daunting odds. The Congo Free State, however, was no ordinary opponent. Backed by European resources and driven by Leopold's unyielding ambition, its forces came equipped with modern weapons, discipline, and a mandate to crush resistance. The war that unfolded was brutal, marked by sieges, ambushes, and decisive encounters that shifted the balance of power back and forth. Villages became battlegrounds, trade routes turned into corridors of war, and the Congo River itself bore witness to the struggle. For Sefiu, the fight was deeply personal. He was not merely defending land or wealth, he was carrying forward his father's legacy. Tippu Tip had navigated a complex world of shifting alliances, balancing Arab networks and European ambitions. Now, Sefiu faced a harsher reality, one where negotiation had failed and only force could decide the future. His leadership was tested daily as he commanded men who looked to him for both strength and hope. Rumaliza stood firmly by his side, ensuring that the flame of resistance did not die out even when the Free State pushed with overwhelming might. As the conflict dragged on into 1893 and 1894, its consequences grew heavier. Every victory brought temporary relief, every setback a painful reminder of the costs of defiance. Yet the determination of Sefiu and Rumaliza's forces was undeniable. They fought not only for themselves but for the right to preserve their authority in a world where European domination was spreading with alarming speed. The war between Sefyu's coalition and Leopold's troops became known as one of the defining confrontations of its time. It symbolized the larger struggle playing out across Africa during the scramble for Africa, when empires carved territories with little regard for those who already lived there. Sefyu and Rumeliza were more than just military leaders, they represented the last great effort of local powers to stand against the tide of colonial expansion. Yet the outcome was inevitable. By 1894, the superior resources of the Congo Free State began to overwhelm Sefyu's forces. Rumeliza, though resolute, could not turn the tide against modern artillery and relentless campaigns. Sefyu himself fell in the fighting, his death marking the end of an era. With his passing, the resistance that had burned so fiercely began to fade, and the Free State tightened its control over the contested lands. The story of this conflict is not one of simple defeat, however. It is a story of resilience, of leaders who stood their ground when others might have yielded, and of communities that resisted until resistance was no longer possible. The war between Sefyu and Leopold's forces reveals the human dimension of history's great shifts, the courage, the sacrifice, and the tragedy that come when worlds collide. For Tippu Tip, who lived to witness the aftermath, the war was a sobering reflection of how quickly power could change hands. His son had fought bravely, his ally had stood firm, but the world was moving in a direction that no single leader could stop. The Congo Free State's victory was not just a military triumph, it was a symbol of how colonial powers were reshaping Africa in ways that would echo for generations. From 1892 to 1894, the rivers and forests of Central Africa bore witness to a struggle that was as much about identity as it was about control. The names of Sefyu bin Hamid and Rumeliza live on in this history, not as mere footnotes, but as figures who dared to resist one of the most relentless forces of their time. Their story is a reminder that history is written not only by the victors but also by those who fought, resisted, and refused to surrender until the very end. By the end of the 19th century, Tippu Tip had lived a life that few could rival. He had commanded vast caravans, forged alliances with explorers and rulers, and seen both triumphs and bitter defeats. But even the most relentless adventurer must one day lay down his arms. Around 1890, Tippu Tip returned to his birthplace of Zanzibar, no longer the fiery leader marching deep into the Congo, but a man who carried with him decades of memory, stories, and reflections. The bustling island, with its winding alleys, fragrant spice markets, and echoes of the Indian Ocean, became the final stage of his remarkable journey. Life in Zanzibar offered a slower rhythm compared to the expeditions of his youth. Here, he was not a commander leading hundreds into the forest but an elder statesman whose presence commanded respect. Visitors came to see him, not just for his reputation but also for his insights into a world that was rapidly changing. By this time, the great powers of Europe were carving Africa into colonies, and Tippu Tip, who had once balanced the interests of local and foreign forces, could only watch as the tide of history swept forward. But Tippu Tip did not simply fade into the background. Instead, he turned to the one thing that would outlast him, the written word. In his later years, he began to dictate his life story in Swahili, the language of the coast and the trade networks he had long dominated. This decision was not just personal, it was revolutionary. Few men of his era, especially in his position, chose to leave behind such a detailed record of their own lives. By setting his story down, he ensured that his voice would echo long after he was gone. The autobiography that emerged was more than a personal reflection, it was a window into an era. Through his words, Tippu Tip recounted journeys across uncharted lands, encounters with foreign explorers, and the intricate web of trade and politics that defined East and Central Africa. His narrative was candid, weaving together triumph and hardship, pride and regret. It revealed not only his own ambitions but also the larger forces at play in a region caught between tradition and the encroaching ambitions of Europe. For readers of Swahili at the time, his work was a rare opportunity to see the world through the eyes of someone who had shaped it. Unlike the accounts written by European explorers, which often cast Africa through a foreign lens, Tippu Tip's autobiography carried the weight of local knowledge, cultural nuance, and first-hand experience. It was his attempt to ensure that history would not be told solely by outsiders but also by those who had lived it. The manuscript did not remain confined to Zanzibar. In 1907, nearly 2 decades after he had retired, his autobiography was translated into German and later into English. With these translations, Tippu Tip's story reached audiences far beyond the shores of East Africa. Scholars, adventurers, and curious readers in Europe discovered not just the man but also the complexity of the world he inhabited. Through his words, they gained a glimpse of how African leaders perceived the rapid changes brought by colonial expansion, and how one man navigated the shifting tides of power. For Tippu Tip, writing his story was perhaps his final act of leadership. No longer able to command armies or sway politics, he instead wielded the pen as his last instrument of influence. His autobiography was his legacy, one that gave future generations the chance to understand the intricacies of East African history from within. It was also a testament to his awareness that the world was changing. Where once oral tradition carried the memory of great leaders, he chose to leave behind a written record that would endure across languages and borders. In Zanzibar, he lived out his final years surrounded by the familiar sounds of the ocean and the hum of the island's markets. The island itself was transforming under new rulers and new systems, yet Tippu Tip remained a figure who drew both reverence and curiosity. For the younger generation, he was a living link to a past that was already fading into legend. For the outside world, he became a symbol of the intricate history of East Africa, neither fully aligned with tradition nor with the new colonial order. When his autobiography appeared in Europe, readers were captivated not only by his adventures but also by the rare perspective he offered. It was one of the first works of its kind to be written by an African leader who had played such a central role in shaping the events of his time. It challenged stereotypes and broadened understandings, presenting Africa not as a blank canvas for outsiders but as a land of powerful actors with their own voices and visions. By the time of his passing in 1905, Tippu Tip had already secured his place in history. Yet his decision to write ensured that he would not be remembered solely through the words of others. His autobiography continues to stand as a vital document, a bridge between worlds, and a reminder of how one man, through both action and reflection, left an indelible mark on the story of Africa. His retirement in Zanzibar, far from being a quiet withdrawal, became the setting for his final contribution to history. Through his pen, or rather, his dictated words, he carved out a legacy that extended beyond the reach of armies or trade caravans. In doing so, Tippu Tip ensured that his story would not fade with the tides but remain, carried forward across languages, oceans, and generations. In 1905, the narrow, winding streets of Stone Town witnessed the quiet end of a man whose name had once carried weight across vast swaths of East and Central Africa. Tippu Tip, born Hamad bin Muhammad, passed away on the island of Zanzibar, struck down by malaria. The fever claimed him in the very place where his life had begun, a fitting yet somber closing of the circle. For decades he had lived at the crossroads of worlds, Arab, Swahili, African, and European, and with his death, an era of transition and turbulence in the region seemed to dim. The stone town of his final days was far different from the Zanzibar of his youth. Colonial officials now held sway where Omani sultans once reigned, and the rhythm of the markets carried whispers of new rulers, new ambitions, and new laws. Tippu Tip himself had once navigated these currents of power with unmatched skill, striking alliances, commanding caravans, and building a reputation that spanned the Indian Ocean and deep into the Congo. But as his body failed him, he left behind not only estates and plantations but also a memory that would remain forever entangled in the wider story of Africa's encounter with the modern world. He had built wealth on an extraordinary scale, leaving behind lands and assets that bore witness to the immense power he had accumulated. Plantations dotted Zanzibar's fertile stretches, their shadows a reminder of the trade networks he once controlled. Though he was no longer present, the fruits of his enterprises continued to shape lives, economies, and legacies long after his passing. His name was woven into the very fabric of Zanzibar's history, whispered in its spice markets, remembered in its houses, and written into its chronicles. Yet wealth and plantations were not the only things Tippu Tip left behind. His story itself became a kind of inheritance for future generations, an inheritance filled with both triumphs and contradictions. He was celebrated by some as a daring explorer and shrewd negotiator, yet remembered by others as a symbol of the shadows that clouded his era. This duality, this tension between achievement and controversy, ensured that he would never be forgotten. His life was not a simple tale of rise and fall, but rather a layered narrative of ambition, power, and consequence. In Stone Town, as the news of his death spread, it was as if the island itself paused. Those who had known him firsthand, whether as ally or rival, spoke of a man who had commanded attention wherever he went. The younger generation, who had grown up hearing of his adventures, now found themselves reflecting on a figure who seemed larger than life. His passing closed the final chapter of a story that spanned continents, cultures, and conflicts, leaving people to grapple with the imprint he had left upon their world. Over the years, Tippu Tip's legacy has sparked debate and reflection. Was he to be remembered as a pioneer who skillfully navigated the shifting tides of his age, or as a man whose influence carried darker undertones? History rarely grants simple answers, and in Tippu Tip's case, it has chosen instead to remember him as both, a man whose life embodied the complexity of Africa in the 19th century, caught between tradition and change, local power and colonial ambition. His autobiography, dictated before his death, carried his voice beyond Stone Town, ensuring that his perspective would endure even as his body rested in Zanzibari soil. Readers across languages and nations would come to know his story, not just as history told by others, but as history told by the man himself. It was this act of writing, as much as his deeds in life, that preserved his place in the chronicles of the past. And so, Tippu Tip's journey ended where it began, under the hot sun and ocean breezes of Zanzibar. His body was claimed by illness, but his name and story continued to move far beyond the island's shores. The plantations he left behind may one day crumble, the wealth may fade into dust, but the mark of his presence, on Africa, on Zanzibar, and on history, remains etched into time. As we close this chapter, reflecting on a life filled with ambition, contradiction, and legacy, let us remember that history is not merely about dates and deeds, but about the human stories that shaped our world. If you found this journey into the past meaningful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love history. Thank you for watching, and have a peaceful night.